They said he was impossible. Not even a billionaire could help him. David Watson tried everything to care for his elderly autistic father. Doctors, nurses, top-tier specialists. Nothing worked. No one could get through. That is, until she arrived. Helena wasn't rich. She wasn't famous. But what she did, quietly, patiently, and without ever raising her voice, completely transformed not just the man, but the entire house. And as for David, what he witnessed next would forever change the way he understood family, purpose, and love. But before we show you what she did, you need to see just how deep the silence had grown and how one woman broke through it with something no amount of money could buy. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing this community grow around the world. This is another heartfelt journey from Mr. Edward's Tales, where you feel the true emotion of stories that make you reflect on life. David Watson's shoes pressed against the familiar wooden steps of the porch with a heaviness that betrayed both fatigue and anticipation. The house stood before him, the same pale green facade he remembered from his childhood, yet now it looked almost like a photograph of itself, frozen in time. He reached for the doorknob slowly, the cool brass under his fingers triggering an avalanche of memories. His mother humming while preparing breakfast, his father's occasional bursts of laughter, the quiet evenings after she passed away. For years, the house had been nothing more than a mausoleum of his guilt and success, a place he visited only to sign papers or check on maintenance. But today felt different. He had come back without his usual entourage, no chauffeur, no assistant, no pretense. As he pushed the door open, he braced himself for the stale air of disuse, for the hollow silence that usually greeted him like an unwelcome host. Instead, a current of sound drifted in, something sharp and unexpected. Laughter. Not the artificial kind he heard at board meetings or charity galas, but raw, unrestrained laughter. He froze in the threshold, his hand still gripping the doorframe, as the unmistakable splash of water and the smell of fresh earth reached him. It was as though the house had inhaled after years of holding its breath. He moved inside cautiously, his polished leather shoes tapping against the old hardwood floors, and every step seemed to betray him, echoing his unease. There had been no staff assigned to live here, no renovation work ordered, and yet the air buzzed with life. Setting his keys on the hallway table, David followed the sounds as if they were a trail of breadcrumbs leading him deeper into some hidden narrative. His heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from disorientation. This was his home, or at least it had been, but the sounds coming from the backyard felt foreign, almost intrusive. He caught himself muttering under his breath, "What the hell is going on here?" His own voice felt too loud against the lively murmur beyond the glass doors. The memory of the backyard as he'd left it, perfectly trimmed hedges, symmetrical flower beds, a marble fountain, clashed violently with the rhythmic splashes and faint voices drifting inside. He loosened his tie and unbuttoned the top of his shirt as he approached the French doors at the end of the hall, the sounds of running water now clearer, almost playful. He could feel the energy of the house pressing on him, urging him to confront whatever waited outside. David's fingers trembled slightly as he pulled the handles and swung the French doors open. What lay beyond was nothing short of a transformation. The once immaculate lawn had been rearranged into something between an obstacle course and a playground. Orange traffic cones lined the edges of muddy paths, black tires were half buried like stepping stones, and a shallow pit of water and earth stretched across the center like a dare. But it wasn't the setting that stopped him cold, it was the figures within it. Crawling through the mud, on hands and knees with an expression of pure focus, was his father. The old man he remembered as distant and fragile now looked strangely alive, wearing a green polo shirt and khaki shorts, his grey hair damp with sweat or water. Bright red noise-cancelling headphones clamped over his ears like a lifeline, insulating him from the chaos around him. He was moving methodically, as though each motion was a mission he had chosen rather than a task imposed. The sight was so alien, so intimate, that David almost called out his name, but stopped, his throat closing around the words. Standing just behind the elderly man was someone David had never met. A woman, tall and poised, with skin the color of polished mahogany, and hair perfectly straightened and tied back. She wore a crisp blue uniform with a white apron that marked her as staff, but nothing about her demeanor suggested subservience. Yellow gloves clung to her hands as she held a garden hose, the stream of water arcing over his father's back in a gentle, deliberate rhythm. She was speaking softly, though David couldn't make out the words. What struck him most was the way his father responded, not recoiling, not shrinking, but leaning subtly toward her voice even as he crawled forward. This was no nurse or casual caretaker. Whoever she was, she had entered his father's private universe and built something functional inside it. David's mind raced to place her, a new employee hired without his approval, a volunteer from some program he'd funded. The image of his father, muddy yet serene, framed by cones and tires, while a stranger orchestrated the scene, felt like an intrusion on a memory he hadn't yet formed. He stepped outside without realizing it, the warm sun hitting his face like a spotlight. "Dad!" he called, his voice breaking slightly. His father didn't look up, continuing his careful crawl across the mud, his fingers pressing into the wet earth with something between curiosity and purpose. The woman's eyes flicked up toward David, calm but assessing, before returning to the elderly man as she spoke a few more low words. David moved closer, his expensive shoes sinking into the damp grass. "Excuse me, what exactly is going on here?" he demanded, though his voice lacked its usual authority. The woman didn't flinch. She adjusted the hose, turned down the pressure, and replied evenly, "He's practicing." Her tone was simple, but it carried an undercurrent of conviction, as if the scene before them needed no further explanation. David blinked, caught off guard by the confidence in her voice. "Practicing what?" he asked, but she didn't answer immediately, focusing instead on guiding his father through another slow movement. For a moment, David felt as though he had stumbled into someone else's story. His father, who had retreated into near silence for years, was moving with intent, mud streaking his arms and knees like war paint. The woman, the black maid whose name he still didn't know, wasn't merely supervising, she was orchestrating. And David, the billionaire accustomed to controlling every variable, stood at the edge of it all, uninvited, a witness to a reality that had grown in his absence. He opened his mouth again to speak, but the words died as his father reached the end of the muddy path, sat back on his heels, and looked up, not at David, but at her. The faintest flicker of a smile crossed the old man's face. David's chest tightened. He had come expecting to confront emptiness, to manage yet another responsibility. Instead, he had found a scene brimming with life, discipline, and something dangerously close to joy. He didn't yet understand it, but he could feel the axis of his world tilting underfoot. David remained frozen at the edge of the yard, his hand gripping the doorframe for balance. He had returned to the house expecting a mausoleum, but what he saw instead was a pulse, a rhythm he hadn't contributed to, hadn't even known was possible. His father's quiet determination, the maid's calm guidance, the transformation of the yard from sterile order to meaningful chaos, all of it felt like a rebuke and an invitation at once. For years, David had believed his wealth could insulate him from the past, from the complicated reality of his family. But now, in the very heart of his childhood home, he saw that something had grown without him, a bond, a routine, a life. He didn't yet know how to step into it, or whether he even should, but the sound of laughter and the smell of earth had already wrapped around him like a net. He realized with a start that he was holding his breath. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he let it out, the warm air trembling between his lips as he watched his father move forward, the hose glinting in the sun, the cones marking the path of some unseen progress. The house he had left behind had come alive again, and for the first time in years, David felt like an intruder in his own story. David stood on the back step for a long moment, paralyzed by the sight in front of him. The once pristine garden, the one his mother had so carefully tended, was unrecognizable. Where once there had been rows of white lilies and hand-trimmed hedges, now there was organized disarray. Old tires stacked like stepping stations, planks of wood balanced between crates, plastic cones outlining paths across the lawn. It looked less like a garden and more like a military-style obstacle course, except not for soldiers. It wasn't the transformation of the yard that disturbed him most. It was who was at the center of it all. His father, who for years barely left the den, was crawling, literally crawling on his elbows and knees, through a section of wet dirt, red headphones tightly secured around his ears. His shirt clung to his back, stained with water and mud, and he smiled with a kind of boyish absorption that David hadn't seen since he was a child. The image was so incompatible with the man David remembered, stoic, fragile, withdrawn, that for a second he wondered if he was hallucinating. He couldn't move. His hands remained limp by his sides, his mind desperately trying to sort through what his eyes refused to reframe. It took several minutes before David could will himself forward. He stepped off the porch and into the grass, his polished Oxfords immediately sinking into the soft earth. The feeling was uncomfortable, invasive almost, like the yard was rejecting his presence. But still, he walked, trying to piece together what had happened here in his absence. He circled around the course slowly, taking it in with growing disbelief. Ropes were tied between wooden stakes, old plastic crates were stacked like barriers, and chalk arrows had been drawn along the concrete stones, guiding a path through the madness. His father was now maneuvering through a set of hanging pool noodles strung between two trees, laughing softly whenever one hit his shoulder. David crouched slightly, calling out, "Dad? What is this?" But his father didn't respond. Either he didn't hear, or he was too focused. The red noise-cancelling headphones blocked out the world around him. David noticed how his father's hand pressed into the earth, as if he needed to feel it directly, how he paused every few steps to breathe in deeply through his nose, as though grounding himself. It wasn't random. It wasn't chaos. There was method in the madness. Then came the voice that had clearly taken root in this house. Careful near that stretch. He gets startled if someone stands too close. David turned sharply. The woman from the previous day, still in her sharp blue uniform, white apron and gloves, stood near the garden hose, coiling it carefully. Her tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't warm either. It was professional, firm. "You built this?" David asked, motioning around the yard. She nodded once. He needed structure, repetition, movement, something his body could understand, even when his words don't come easily. "So yes, I built it. With him." David approached her slowly. "You mean to tell me my father agreed to this?" The woman gave a small, dry chuckle. "He didn't agree. He participated. There's a difference?" She met his gaze without flinching. "Autism in old age is lonely, Mr. Watson. People retreat into routines because the world becomes too sharp. But this," she gestured to the course, to the mud, to the joy on his father's face. "This is a routine he built with his own body." David looked at her again, this time more carefully. There was no arrogance in her posture, no need for validation. She knew exactly what she had done and why. David watched as his father reached the final stretch of the course, a low wooden beam set across two crates. His knees wobbled as he tried to lift himself, and for a second, David took an instinctive step forward. But the maid stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Let him try." The old man, shaking slightly, placed his palms on the beam, hoisted his torso, and slowly swung one leg over, then the other. When he finally sat atop it, breathing heavily but grinning, the maid applauded softly, no clapping, just hands moving in the air, silent praise. David stood frozen. "He hasn't done anything like this in years," he whispered. "He hasn't even stood up without help." The maid nodded. "He's not standing because of me. He's standing because it makes sense to him now. This course wasn't made to fix him. It was made to give him back his agency." David rubbed his face, overwhelmed. "And the cones, the mud, the tires." She shrugged. "Sensory stimulation, predictable layout, creative challenge, and also," she added with a smile, "he enjoys getting dirty. You'd be surprised how many grown men never outgrow that." He picked up a piece of wet rope, feeling the grain between his fingers. "So you're saying this mess is helping him think more clearly?" The maid stepped beside him, her voice calm. "I'm saying he stopped disappearing when he had something to build toward, something measurable, something he could feel and complete." David stared at the course again, this time seeing it not as chaos but as communication. It was built with junk, but it spoke with purpose. His father had built this with her. "I don't even know your name," he said quietly. "Helena," she replied. "I'm here to help him, but not for you, not for your money." David laughed bitterly, standing. "Of course not. You're the only person in this house who seems to know what they're doing." Helena didn't smile. She merely nodded once, then turned to go. "You can help if you're willing. But if you're just here to spectate, don't interfere. He notices more than you think." David didn't respond. He looked once more at his father, now crouching again to inspect a pine cone near one of the cones. That look on his face, it wasn't confusion. It was peace. As David finally stood upright and began walking back toward the steps of the porch, his father shifted into a new segment of the course. Crawling on all fours again through another line of tires, the red headphones firm on his head, his green polo soaked and spattered with earth. He looked utterly immersed, smiling softly as he moved forward, one hand pressed firmly into the ground, the other leading him through the dark soil. David stopped on the bottom step and looked back one last time. The yard, once a place for wine tastings and photo ops, had become something raw and honest, a place his father could exist without judgment or failure. David felt a strange sensation creep up his spine, not discomfort, not confusion, just a new awareness that maybe, just maybe, this was what healing looked like. No luxury, no speeches, just cones, ropes, and the freedom to crawl without shame. And in the middle of it all, his father, elderly, autistic, and more alive than David had seen him in over a decade, smiled as he pushed forward, knees sinking into the dirt, immersed in a strange, beautiful kind of play. David froze, utterly shocked by the scene. David remained still for several minutes, his gaze fixed on the woman holding the garden hose. Everything about her presence demanded attention, not by force, but by the calm precision with which she operated. She was focused, methodical, and yet nothing about her movements felt mechanical. Her skin, deep and rich in tone, glowed under the afternoon light, and her hair, straight and neatly tied into a bun, didn't move as she adjusted the nozzle, aiming a gentle spray of water across the muddy ground. Her body posture was upright, her arms steady, and her expression, softly smiling, seemed to carry a kind of inward peace. David had encountered hundreds of professionals, thousands of employees across his career, and yet he had never seen someone manage a space, and people within it, with such quiet authority. He wanted to speak, to ask questions, to assert control, but the moment felt sacred, like interrupting would tear something delicate. She shifted slightly, moved her left foot half a step back, and followed the elderly man with her eyes, anticipating his movements, adjusting the stream to avoid startling him. She didn't shout instructions. She didn't plead for his cooperation. She simply created space for him to exist exactly as he was. Finally, David cleared his throat. "You're Helena, right?" he asked, his voice hoarse from silence. The woman looked up slowly, giving him a small nod. "Yes, you must be David." It wasn't a question. She knew exactly who he was. There was no flattery, no recognition of his status, just acknowledgement. I didn't know anyone was staying here, he said, stepping closer. Helena adjusted the hose again, pausing the stream momentarily before turning it back on. I don't stay. I come daily, early mornings. I leave after he eats dinner, sometimes later if he's in a state. David frowned. State? Helena's eyes flicked back toward the man crawling in the mud, now inspecting a plastic cone with deep focus. Yes, autistic shutdowns, overwhelm. You'd know that if you spent more time with him. David clenched his jaw but said nothing. She wasn't being cruel. She was simply factual. He didn't know. He hadn't spent time with his father in years, not beyond obligatory holiday calls or the rare, uncomfortable dinner. He doesn't like to be touched when he's in that state, doesn't speak, but he responds to water, the sensation, the temperature. That's why I use the hose, controlled stimulation. Helena's words were steady, like someone explaining how to care for a plant or an animal with precision, not because she lacked empathy, but because precision was the highest form of empathy she had to offer. David moved closer still, his shoes squelching in the damp ground. He watched his father with new eyes. The man was covered in earth, his movements deliberate but slow, his attention fully consumed by the arrangement of cones and ropes. David turned back to Helena. How long has this training ground been here? He asked. 3 months, she answered without hesitation. Started small, a few tires, 1 plank. Then he started responding, initiating actions, choosing paths. So I followed his lead. Her tone never changed, but David detected the pride beneath her words. You did this all yourself? Helena met his eyes again. With him, she repeated. Always with him. That distinction, with him, not for him, hit David harder than he expected. It wasn't charity. It wasn't obligation. It was collaboration. His father, long believed to be beyond engagement, had participated in building something, and Helena had chosen to listen instead of lead. Why? He asked, genuinely puzzled. Why do all this? Helena looked at him long before answering. Because no one else was trying, and because he deserves more than to be managed. He deserves to participate. He may not speak like us, but he communicates. You just have to pay attention. And you're... what exactly? A nurse? A therapist? He asked, searching for labels that could make this dynamic easier to categorize. Helena shook her head. I'm a caregiver. Professionally trained, yes. But titles don't do much when you're in the dirt with someone who doesn't trust the world to stay still. Her words weren't defensive, just resolute. She let the hose fall to her side, water trickling into the soil. He trusts me because I don't force him to fit into routines that don't make sense to him. I adapted to his rhythm. That's the only reason any of this works. David folded his arms, processing. So what happens when you're gone? When you leave for good? Helena gave a small shrug. That's your part. You're his son. If you want this to continue, you'll have to decide what role you want to play, but don't insert yourself just because you feel guilty. He'll know the difference. Her words, again, held no judgment, only facts. David hated how much they stung. He had come back expecting to repair a house. Instead, he had walked into a life already being lived, one he had no hand in building. As his father crawled toward the final stretch of the course, Helena resumed spraying a gentle arc of water just ahead of him, guiding without pressuring. The old man paused, reached down, and began pushing a small plastic ball through the mud, tracing a wobbly path. He likes patterns, she said, almost absent-mindedly. Things that move the way he expects. The ball helps with coordination and focus. David watched as his father followed the ball slowly, completely absorbed, smiling faintly. Helena stood beside him, neither rushing him nor explaining anything else. Her presence didn't demand control. It created consistency. You changed him, David said quietly. Helena finally looked back at him. No, I gave him space to be unchanged. That's all he needed. Her eyes didn't challenge his, but neither did they yield. David felt suddenly small in her presence, not because she diminished him, but because she stood so fully in her own purpose. There was no performance in her, no flattery. She had come here to do a job and ended up building a new framework for a man the world had stopped trying to understand. David opened his mouth to speak, but found nothing appropriate to say. Instead, he simply watched. At the center of it all was Helena, hose in hand, a calm smile on her lips, her eyes following every motion of the elderly man with quiet attentiveness. She made no announcements, gave no loud praise, issued no commands. Yet every detail in that space, the arcs of water, the arrangement of the cones, the choice of tools, bore her signature. Her control was not loud, it was precise. She knew when to intervene and when to stand still. Her care didn't demand gratitude or acknowledgement. It was evident in the way the man trusted her presence without needing to glance back. David turned slightly, finally letting out the breath he'd been holding. He'd expected to confront decay. Instead, he had found growth, engineered by the hands of a woman who had refused to give up on what everyone else had quietly buried. She didn't dominate the space. She coordinated it. Firm, gentle, present. David stared at her as his father resumed crawling across the final patch of grass. He had seen CEOs, generals, and scientists lead rooms full of people, but none of them had moved another human being like this. Not with power, not with fear, but with quiet, disciplined care. It was her. She had built this entire world. David had never seen his father like this. Not once. Not in childhood. Not in the solemn years after his mother's death. Not in the brief, uncomfortable moments they'd shared during holidays or obligatory visits. There was something utterly disarming about the scene unfolding in front of him. His father, knees and hands coated in drying earth, crawling with deliberate joy around the last curve of the makeshift obstacle path. It was more than participation. It was liberation. The old man, often treated like fragile glass, was fully immersed, wholly unguarded, smiling to himself as if he were chasing a memory only he could see. And yet, it wasn't regression. It wasn't childishness. David could see that clearly now. It was rhythm, it was purpose. It was a person operating in perfect synchrony with his own inner tempo. The autism that had once made his father seem distant and unreachable now made sense. It wasn't absence, it was another frequency, one David had never tuned into until Helena created the conditions for it to be heard. And now, watching his father like this, muddy, focused, joyful, David felt as if he were the outsider looking in, no longer the orchestrator of the family legacy, but a spectator to something more profound. Helena, standing a few steps away, held something in both hands, carefully cupped as if it were fragile. Her eyes remained on the man crawling forward, but the faint curve of a smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. When David finally walked up beside her, she didn't speak. Instead, she glanced at him briefly, then back to the scene. His father had just completed the final movement, placing a small plastic ring onto a peg stuck in the ground, and sat down cross-legged in the mud, exhaling deeply. The satisfaction on his face was quiet but complete. "He made that move up himself last week," Helena said softly, nodding toward the ring. "It wasn't part of the course originally, but now it's how he ends his sessions, every day." David didn't know what to say. For once, he didn't feel the need to perform a role, executive, son, man of the house. He simply watched. "He has rules," Helena continued. "He sets them. I follow. That's the deal." The simplicity of that dynamic struck David as deeply intelligent. No therapy jargon, no overcompensation, just clear trust and shared structure. The woman beside him had not only reawakened his father, she had learned to follow his language. When his father finally looked up, Helena approached him without hesitation. She crouched slowly, not intruding on his space, and extended her hands toward him, revealing the small, round object she had been carrying. It was a medal, hand formed from dried clay, strung through with a blue ribbon. Its edges were uneven, and the imprint in its center was simple but unmistakable. Team Watson, carved in slightly crooked letters. The old man stared at it for a moment, his expression unreadable, then reached out and touched it with one muddy fingertip. Helena didn't press him. She waited. After a few seconds, he took the medal, rubbed its edge against his palm, and then carefully slipped it over his head. It rested awkwardly against his chest, half covered in dirt, but he didn't adjust it. He just let it hang there. David stood frozen. It was such a small gesture, a childlike trinket, but in that moment it carried a weight he couldn't quite name. "He made the first version himself," Helena explained. "The letters came out backwards, but he didn't care. He said, 'Team Watson,' clear as day." It's one of the only spontaneous phrases I've ever heard him say out loud. They hadn't shared this kind of proximity in years. The elder Watson looked at him now, not with recognition in the traditional sense, but with an openness that David couldn't recall seeing since he was a boy. "Did you make this, Dad?" he asked, his voice rough. His father didn't speak, but he looked down at the medal and tapped it twice with a single finger. David's breath hitched. That was an answer. "I didn't know you liked working with clay," he said, attempting something close to conversation. His father tilted his head slightly, then smiled, just a hint of it, before returning his gaze to the grass. Helena watched them both silently, her hands now folded in front of her. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, mostly for show, and wiped his hands on it uselessly, not knowing what else to do. "This team," he said finally, "I want to be part of it." His father didn't react, but he didn't pull away either. And that, David realized, was a beginning, not a breakthrough, not a cure, but the first honest interaction they'd had in years. Helena stepped in then, holding out a second medal. "He made this one for you," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. David stared at it. It was almost identical to the one his father wore, slightly misshapen, clearly handmade, but with his name crudely carved beneath the words, "Team Watson." His hands moved on their own as he took the medal from her. The clay felt dry and solid, but not fragile. It had been hardened, fired in some makeshift oven, maybe even baked under the sun. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Because he sees you here now," Helena replied. "That matters more than you know." David looked down at the object in his palm. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned it over. There were fingerprints in the clay, his father's. The same hands that once held ledger books and organized tool drawers with obsessive precision had shaped this crude, beautiful thing. It wasn't a grand gesture, it wasn't a declaration, it was inclusion, a silent invitation. And for the first time in his life, David didn't feel like a Watson because of blood or name or money. He felt like a Watson because someone had carved it into clay and handed it to him without expecting anything in return. David stood there in the yard, surrounded by cones, ropes, and mud, holding the handmade medal in his shaking hands. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just looked at it, the uneven edges, the crooked letters, the little ridge where someone's fingernail had pressed too hard. It was imperfect, rough, and undeniably real, just like his father, just like everything he had ignored or overlooked for years. Helena had stepped back by now, giving him space, watching quietly as David processed something far larger than the object itself. This wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was family, rebuilt in silence and sweat and dirt. The man who had once built empires now stood humbled by a lump of dried clay, and for the first time he didn't resent it. He embraced it. He breathed it in. And as the weight of the medal settled in his palm, so too did the truth. His father, always different, was not broken. He had simply been waiting to be seen, to be heard, to be invited back into the team. And now, through this single fragile symbol, David felt that door open. As Helena stepped forward and gently placed her hand on his shoulder, He closed his fingers around the medal, his hands trembling. David had always thought of structure as something cold. Schedules, board meetings, fiscal reports, project pipelines. But what he witnessed now in his childhood home was structure of another kind entirely. Helena had transformed the backyard into something resembling a field base. Cones and ropes mapped out routes. Tires were stacked with purpose. Even a chalkboard had been repurposed to outline daily tasks. It looked absurd at first glance, chaotic at second, but upon closer inspection it was undeniably coordinated. Each obstacle had a logic behind it. His father was no longer just crawling through mud or handling loose objects. Now he was completing missions, clear, timed, repeatable missions, with a structure built around his capacity for focus, repetition, and predictability. David watched him trace the same route 3 times without pause, using his own handmade tools, a wooden spoon to push a tennis ball through a narrow channel, a plastic ring to drop over cones arranged in color-coded order. Each task ended with a quiet nod from Helena, never overly enthusiastic, just enough to affirm. This was more than care. It was command. It was discipline born from respect, not pity. His father didn't just respond to this structure, he relied on it. Inside the house, things were no different. The once quiet and sparsely used kitchen had been completely repurposed. Gone were the wine glasses and untouched recipe books from David's mother's era. The large oak table now held toy figurines, laminated cards, and a corkboard covered in visual charts. Helena called it the strategy room, and not sarcastically. Each morning his father was given a mission briefing. Helena had made picture-based routines with Velcro pieces that allowed him to move tasks around as needed. Morning hygiene, movement time, rest corner, sound blocks, craft work. David stared at it the first time he entered the room and said, "You turned our kitchen into a war room." Helena didn't even look up from what she was doing. He responds well to military structure. It's what he used to watch on television for years. This is familiar logic to him. So yes, we built a command center. David was stunned, not just by the efficiency, but by the respect. She hadn't simplified his father's life by removing challenge. She had made it navigable. The whole routine was a game, but not a childish one. It had ranks, rules, and consequences that made sense. His father thrived not in freedom, but in clarity. Over time, David began to notice details that once would have escaped him. His father didn't fidget aimlessly. He tapped 3 times before beginning a task, signaling readiness. He hummed a single note whenever he needed more time, and Helena would adjust the next step without saying a word. They had built a communication system that existed entirely outside of spoken language, but it worked. More than worked. It sang. David sat in one morning session just to observe. Helena placed 3 colored blocks on the table, each representing a sensory task. His father chose the green one, clay work. She handed him the tools, and he immediately got to work crafting a new token, smoothing its edges with a brush dipped in water. "He's preparing his own currency," she explained. "He earns tokens for completing missions. Then he trades them in for things he chooses." David raised an eyebrow. "What kind of things?" Helena shrugged. "Music, extra movement time, sometimes just a new notebook. He picks, I honor it." That system had dignity embedded in it. No infantilizing, no rewards imposed by someone who thought they knew better. It was negotiated respect. Structure here wasn't just survival, it was recognition. It didn't take long for David to realize that Helena's role in the household had long since passed the threshold of traditional caregiving. She didn't just manage routines, she authored them. She adapted on the fly. One afternoon, when his father refused to move into the next activity, Helena didn't push. She knelt beside him and said, "Command has revised today's mission. You'll complete navigation after break protocol." His father nodded once and followed. David stood watching from the doorway, dumbfounded. "Do you just make that up?" he asked. Helena replied, "It's not about making it up. It's about making it work." There were no punishments, no shame tactics. Just corrections, reframings, incentives that met him where he was, instead of where people thought he should be. David thought of the institutions he'd investigated years ago when they first suspected his father was slipping. They were all filled with locked doors, loud voices, staff that tried to manage behavior like it was a problem. But here, in this modest house, David saw that behavior wasn't the issue. It was misinterpretation. His father didn't need to be calmed or silenced. He needed missions, order, autonomy within rules he trusted. And Helena had cracked that code. Eventually, David found himself participating, not out of obligation, but curiosity. Helena handed him a laminated card with 2 tasks: assist with prep and observe movement circuit. He laughed. Seriously? She didn't blink. If you want to help, learn the system. If you want to lead, follow first. So he did. He helped sort the tokens into labeled containers. He timed his father's circuit laps and recorded the results just as Helena instructed. Slowly, the process became less foreign. He stopped trying to fix or direct and started listening. The disarray he once thought irrational became logical. Every cone, every token, every small gesture Helena made had purpose. She had built a new order within this household, one based on mutual respect, careful design, and a refusal to settle for less than what his father deserved. And for the first time, David started to understand, not just what his father needed, but how little he himself had ever tried to understand in the first place. His old frameworks, control, pressure, performance, had no place here. Helena had rewritten the manual, and so the yard became a headquarters. The kitchen became a strategy room. Missions were laid out each morning with cards and tokens, and rewards were chosen with quiet pride. Helena had turned every element of unpredictability into something structured, manageable, even meaningful. His father rose each day knowing what was expected and, more importantly, knowing why. There were rules now, and within them, freedom. David saw Helena move from station to station like a commander, not loud, not cold, but steady. He watched his father salute her after completing a clay task, and she saluted back, never once treating him like a child. David didn't know when the shift occurred, but somewhere in all of it, he stopped seeing a broken man and started seeing someone reassembled on new terms. This wasn't caretaking. This was command with compassion. David stood by the door to the kitchen one morning, laminated task card in hand, eyes on Helena as she led another planning session, and he realized the truth. She hadn't brought chaos into his father's world. She had brought structure to the chaos that was already there, and now, for the first time, he was beginning to understand. The change happened so gradually that David didn't notice it until he heard his own voice filling the kitchen one night. It had started with a casual question, an offhand comment about a toy soldier on the table. Helena had nodded toward his father and asked, "Did he ever serve?" David had chuckled, then paused. "No, but he used to pretend to. When I was a kid, he'd set up bunkers out of couch cushions. Gave me code names, had drills. We thought it was just play, but looking back it was more than that." That opened the door, and once the door opened, stories began to leak out like water from a slow crack in a dam. Each night after dinner and after the final mission of the day, Helena would sit at the table with a cup of tea, David beside her, and his father sitting across from them, sometimes drawing, sometimes just listening. The talking started naturally, no rules, no expectations. David spoke of tree houses, of the way his mother used to tuck notes into his lunchbox, of the way his father built entire shelving systems just to organize his action figures. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't grand, but it was real. Helena didn't just listen. She added her own stories, weaving them in without overshadowing. "When I was 10, she said once, my grandmother made me kneel on rice if I forgot to clean under the bed. It sounds cruel now, but she said it was about discipline. I just think she hated dust. That made David laugh for the first time in a long while. Another night she shared how she'd stolen a book from the library because no one in her neighborhood was allowed to get a card without a permanent address. It was Anne of Green Gables. I still have it. Took me 2 weeks to stop feeling guilty. The stories weren't moral lessons. They were confessions, glimpses into a life that hadn't always been stable or easy, but had shaped someone capable, firm, and resilient. David listened with growing respect. Helena's past wasn't framed in tragedy, nor did she center herself in it. She shared just enough to level the field, to make space for connection. The more she spoke, the more David felt the distance between them shrink, not because they shared a background, but because they shared the will to keep moving through difficult things. His father didn't speak often, but when he did, it came in fragments, short bursts of memory, out of order, but crystal clear. "Red bike," he'd say abruptly, pointing toward nothing in particular. Helena would wait, then gently prompt, "Did you have a red bike?" He would nod. Sometimes he would add, "Gears stuck, always to the left." David confirmed it one night. "Yeah, I remember that. You cursed that bike every time we went to the park." That earned a small smile. Other times the memories were less coherent but still vivid. She made apple slices. "Cut sideways, not down," he muttered once, eyes fixed on a spoon. David stared. "Mom did that. She said it made them look like stars." His father didn't answer, but the way he rubbed his thumb against his palm suggested recognition. These pieces, these broken mirrors of the past, didn't need to be complete to be valuable. Each one added to the picture. Helena treated them like treasures, never pressing, never correcting, just letting them land. And as they stacked, red bike, star apples, broken radio, David realized his father hadn't forgotten everything. He just remembered differently. One night, as the three of them sat after dinner, Helena pushed a small box across the table. "Your father made these," she said. Inside were tokens similar to the clay medals, but each had an engraving, a word, a symbol, sometimes just an initial. "He gives them to people who share stories," she explained. "It's his way of acknowledging them, participating." David pulled one out. It said L in messy lines. "What's this?" he asked. His father looked at him, then down at the table. After a long pause, he said, "Lunchbox." David's throat tightened. "L for lunchbox?" Another nod. "The notes," he added. David didn't even know his father had remembered those. Helena smiled, not saying anything more. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full of memory, of things that had once been buried. They weren't trying to revive the past. They were simply making space for it to breathe. Each story, each name or object remembered, became a shared thread, stitching them closer together. And though David had once believed the house had been too silent to echo, now it echoed with something better: presence. As the routine solidified, David began to anticipate the nightly talks. He even brought props, a photo album one night, a childhood trophy another. They weren't grand gestures. He wasn't trying to heal anything by force. He was just showing up. And slowly his father started to respond, not always in words, but in posture, in touch. One evening, as David described a camping trip they took when he was 7, his father reached across the table and touched the tip of his finger to David's medal. Just once, just a tap. It said more than any sentence could. "He remembers more when he feels safe," Helena said softly. "Stories ground him. They give him something to attach to. We all need anchors." David nodded. For years he had thought himself the anchor of the family, the one who held things together with money and logic. But now he saw the truth. His father was the anchor. Helena was the compass. And David, for the first time in his life, was finally learning how to navigate. They weren't fixing what was broken. They were speaking what had never been said. And it was enough. And just like that, The house changed, not with renovations, not with noise, but with voices. Eleanor's recounting her stubbornness as a teenager, her fierce grandmother, her stolen book. David's weaving stories of lost dogs, failed science fairs, and his mother's quiet brilliance, and his father's, fragile, broken, but undeniably present. He never told full stories, but his fragments were contributions, anchors, echoes of who he was and still could be. The nights no longer ended in silence. They ended with laughter, with hands brushing over old photographs, with clay tokens passed across the table like medals. There were no dramatic speeches, no catharsis, just steady presence, story by story. A household once buried in quiet now pulsed with voices, small, personal, essential. And in that humble rhythm of shared memories, the foundation of something deeper was being laid. Not a return to what once was, but the start of something entirely new. The nights had changed, and in their change they had become the heart of everything else. David had spent most of his adult life trying to outrun the version of himself that had grown up in that house. For years, he convinced himself that the pain, the awkwardness, the quiet failures of connection could all be managed with distance, money, and success. He bought companies, properties, and silence. And for a time, that worked. Or at least, it dulled the sharp edges. But now, watching his father press his palms into wet earth, dirt streaking up his arms as he led a self-created task through the backyard course, David saw how hollow that solution had really been. His father wasn't broken. He wasn't some fragile relic that needed to be hidden. He was leading, with clarity, with rhythm, with a kind of raw sensory conviction that no boardroom had ever shown David. And the truth hit hard. All those years he had tried to fix what he thought was a problem, when in fact he'd been avoiding what could have been a relationship. Elena had never framed it as such. She never said it outright, but her actions had made it undeniable. In the dirt, in the mud, in the smallest of gestures, a man who'd once been written off had built a system of dignity. David didn't announce his realization. There was no speech, no tearful apology. That wasn't how any of this worked. Instead, he picked up one of the laminated routine cards Helena had laid out that morning and quietly took his father's place beside the tokens. "He usually starts with the left one," Helena said, not surprised, not even questioning his choice to join. David nodded and mimicked the action, brushing a small blue token into position and saying softly, "Task 1, cone pattern." His father, kneeling nearby, tilted his head toward the sound. Then, without speaking, he moved into position. David guided the first part, then stepped aside, letting his father take control. And he did, completing the sequence with minimal correction, pausing only once to realign a tire with his foot. Helena stayed nearby but said nothing, her presence steady as always. Afterward, David sat with her at the table. "I used to think control meant power," he admitted, "that if I could just pay for the right people, the right programs, I'd feel at peace with him. But it never worked." Helena looked at him, not with judgment but with understanding. "Control isn't connection," she said. "It's protection. And protection without presence doesn't mean much." He didn't want saving. He didn't want someone to redesign the system. He just wanted a teammate who respected the rules already in place. David began to realize that his years of absence hadn't created a vacuum. Helena and his father had filled it, and not just with routines, with meaning. What had once felt like senseless rituals now revealed themselves to be language. Each task, each token, each step of the course, they were all part of a vocabulary David had never bothered to learn. But now, he was learning. His father had become the one who led. And David followed, not blindly, but with curiosity, with intention. The leadership was subtle, but absolute. If David misstepped, his father would pause, shake his head slightly, and redirect. If David got something right, there'd be a quiet nod, maybe a small gesture of confirmation. Helena never interfered. She knew the dynamic had shifted. She had prepared the terrain and stepped back, letting father and son redefine their terms. The frown lines on David's face began to ease, not because things had gotten easier, but because they had gotten real. Their roles had inverted, and it felt right. David had led companies, built systems, written protocols, but none of that had taught him how to follow his father through a world of cones, ropes, and quiet commands. And now, he didn't need to lead. He didn't want to. He began to find comfort in being a contributor, not a commander. In the kitchen, Helena set up missions as usual, but now David was helping arrange them. "Your father likes having you in prep," she noted one morning, as they aligned the blocks for the first task. "He hums more when you're nearby." David blinked at that. Hums. Yes, it's a regulation sound, self-soothing. It also means focus and trust. Those simple words landed with more weight than any boardroom victory. Trust. Not given because of blood, but because of participation. It wasn't enough to show up. David had to engage, to humble himself, to belong. This wasn't about mending a past that had already been carved in stone. It was about shaping the present, one clay medal, one routine at a time, and Helena had given them the tools to do it. But she didn't hold their hands. She let them work for it. Eventually, David began to see even the former pain differently. The years of emotional distance, the awkward silences, the failed conversations, they weren't just failures. They were misplaced translations. Attempts to speak without learning the other's language. Now, through Helena's guidance, they weren't just translating, they were co-authoring. One morning, as they finished the second set of cone runs, David's father surprised him. He pointed at the timer and said, 12. Good. 2 words, spoken clearly. David froze. Helena, standing a few feet away, gave the faintest smile. It wasn't about how many words. It was about choice, about comfort. David nodded and replied, 12. You led that one. His father didn't smile, but he placed a hand briefly on David's forearm, then continued to the next phase. That moment stayed with him. It was the opposite of everything David had once thought parenting and legacy were about. It wasn't about leaving something behind. It was about staying long enough to build something together. And his father, without ever asking for it, had created that path. David hadn't just rejoined the family. He had been recruited into something far more intimate and real, a mission of mutual recognition. David had once assumed that legacy meant inheritance, passing down assets, knowledge, or reputation. But now he saw it clearly. Legacy is also about healing. Not erasing the past, but meeting it where it stands and offering your hands to help carry the weight forward. In the mud, in the silence, in the slow, deliberate actions of a man once dismissed as fading, David found leadership. Not the loud kind, not the demanding kind, but a leadership rooted in presence, repetition, and earned trust. Helena had helped shape it. But it was his father who now held the compass, and David at last understood. He was no longer the center of this story. He wasn't the fixer. He wasn't the architect. His father, autistic, aging, imperfect, was leading, not by design, not by speech, but by example. And David followed, not out of guilt, not out of fear, but because he finally saw the path. What once had felt like burden now felt like partnership. What once had been shame was now pride. And as they completed another lap around the course, Helena tracking time from the porch, David didn't feel like he was helping. He felt like he was part of a team. And his father was at the front, leading with his heart. It started with color, unexpected, simple color. The first time David noticed it, he was walking down the hallway toward the kitchen and caught a glimpse of something faint on the wall. At first he thought it was a smudge or a stain, maybe mud tracked in by his father. But when he got closer, he saw the unmistakable strokes of crayon, thick blue lines forming a wonky rectangle with green spirals inside. It was crude, like a child's drawing, but intentional. Below it, in shaky letters, were the words "Plan Tent." He stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to laugh or cry. It was a drawing of the tent from the backyard obstacle course. His father had memorialized it on the wall with wax. "He asked me for crayons last week," Helena said, appearing behind him. "I didn't think he'd use the walls, but he does that now." David smiled. "Did you stop him?" "Why would I?" she said simply. "It's his house too." That hit deeper than she probably intended. For years, David had kept the house as a museum, a monument to memory. But now, with these childlike drawings spreading across the walls, the house was becoming something else entirely. Alive. The walls weren't the only thing that changed. The routines remained, the missions, the tokens, the kitchen strategy table. But something had softened around the edges. There was more laughter now, more flexibility. David caught himself offering to help without being asked. Helena let him run a session solo for the first time, stepping back while he guided his father through a short sequence involving stacking blocks and transferring water between cups. It didn't go perfectly. His father spilled twice, and David forgot to give the reward token at the end, but no one corrected him. Helena just smiled and handed him a notebook afterward. Inside were notes written in her precise handwriting. Observation: responded better when you waited 3 seconds before giving instruction. Try again tomorrow. She wasn't training him like a child. She was treating him like a partner. In the evenings they added something new: music. David would bring in his laptop, and his father, still wearing his red headphones, would select from a list of tracks using a printed chart. Jazz, mostly, sometimes classical. Once, oddly, a techno remix that made Helena laugh so hard she had to leave the room. "I did not see that coming," she said, wiping her eyes. Neither did David, but he welcomed it. Their conversations grew more relaxed too, not just between Helena and David, but between David and his father. The words were still sparse, but the silences weren't heavy anymore. One afternoon, as they planted herbs in small ceramic pots, another new routine, David told a story about failing a math test in 7th grade. "I lied to Mum, told her the teacher lost it. She found the test under my bed a week later." His father chuckled, an actual chuckle. Then he looked up from the soil and said, "You cried, on the porch." David blinked. "You remember that?" His father nodded, then tapped the side of the flower pot. "You drew a sad face. Here." He mimicked a circle with his finger. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "God, I thought I was alone that day." Helena, nearby, said nothing. She just passed them the watering can and let the moment sit. That became the rhythm. Conversation triggered by tasks, fragments of memory unlocked by action. There were no therapy goals, no breakthroughs being chased. Just honest, mutual movement forward, and the more they moved, the more whole everything began to feel. Not fixed, but claimed. One afternoon, David found his father already in the yard, digging at a new patch of earth near the fence. Helena was beside him, holding a tray of small seedlings, marigolds, lavender, basil. "What's going on?" he asked, walking over. "Garden," his father said. The word came clearly without hesitation. Helena smiled. He decided the training ground should grow something. Said it was time. David crouched beside them and picked up a trowel. "I'll take that as an official order from command." His father handed him a seedling. They worked without needing to talk much after that. The planting was slow, precise, and strangely joyful. Dirt packed gently. Roots settled with care. When it was done, they sat on the grass together, looking at the rose. "He wants to name it," Helena said. "I suggested Watson Garden, but he shook his head." David looked at his father. "What name, then?" The old man shrugged. Then with a stick he scrawled 3 letters into the dirt. TMW. Helena leaned in. Team Millionaire Watson? David laughed. Team Muddy Watson. His father gave a rare, full smile. The name stuck. They agreed to paint a sign next week. Something permanent, but playful, just like the life they were finally building. The transformation wasn't about routines or activities anymore. It was about culture, a culture of care, of listening, of shared leadership. David no longer saw Helena as the help, and she never asked for more than her role, though it was clear to everyone she ran the soul of the household. She had created something no doctor or therapist or institution had ever managed. Access. Access to a man the world thought was lost. Access to a son who thought he had nothing left to give. Together, they hadn't repaired the past. They had redefined the present. The old kitchen calendar was now filled with clay tokens marking accomplishments. The living room had boxes of crafting materials, and the hallway had new drawings each week. David's suits were still in the closet, but most days he wore jeans and sneakers. He still took meetings remotely, but he never missed morning routine. His priorities had shifted without fanfare. No dramatic declarations, no sudden revelations, just steady choices, each one rooted in staying, in helping, in being. The house no longer required silence to maintain its dignity. It thrived in noise, in motion, in crooked crayon lines and mismatched flower rows. And that, David realized, was exactly what life should look like. The house had changed, not through renovations or reinvention, but through inhabiting. The walls were no longer sterile. They were full of waxy color and uneven lettering, proof of presence. The air smelled of fresh dirt and strong coffee, two things his father insisted on beginning each day with now. David had memorized the new order of routines not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He watched, not from a place of control, but of admiration. And on one quiet morning, he looked out the kitchen window and saw it, his father kneeling in the dirt, hands deep in the flower bed, Helena beside him, laughing at something only the two of them could hear. The rows of newly planted flowers looked crooked, and the soil was uneven, but it didn't matter. David leaned against the doorframe and smiled. The man who had once terrified him with his silence was now building something with his hands. The woman who had walked into their lives with quiet resolve had become the backbone of their joy. Life had returned. Not polished, not perfect, but alive, moving, honest. What was once locked in grief and distance now thrived in motion, chaos, and joy, and that, David knew now, was enough. Thank you for joining us for this powerful journey on Mr. Edward's Tales. If this story moved you as much as it did us, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel for more immersive tales, and leave a comment below telling us what you felt. And if you know someone who would love this story, share it with them right now. Help us spread these stories to more hearts. See you in the next tale.